Hey, welcome back to Incessantly Seeking Season 2. Let's talk about love. Today, I have here Dr. Ingrid Clayton, who is going to be talking to us from personal experience, but also from her clinical, empirical, everything that you've seen as a therapist, what you've heard from your clients, what you experienced yourself in this narcissistic survival story that we keep hearing more and more each day. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'd love for you to share with the audience a little bit about your background of your personal story. How did you come to this narcissistic conclusion? You wrote a book called Beliving Me based on your experience as a child growing up. That, you know, I like we mentioned before we started recording, I've been reading your work. I've been listening to you talk about your experience, and you know, it was a moment of realization. Oh, this is what happened to me.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think like a lot of people who experienced narcissistic abuse or any type of sort of emotional abuse or neglect, even these sort of traumatic events that are a little more hidden in nature, they're not as obvious as, say, physical abuse or sexual abuse. There tends to be this minimization around, well, you know, you can easily, well, they didn't hit me, right? I wasn't assaulted. And I think historically trauma has really been looked at through these other lenses of physical abuse or wartime or these other larger, sort of more obvious, devastating things that everyone could agree on. Yes, this is a traumatic event. But what we're starting to unpack and understand more and more all the time, thank goodness, is that there's something called complex trauma, which could be synonymous with relational trauma, childhood trauma. And it's an experience of ongoing, sort of pervasive traumatic events and the way that those take root in your nervous system and the impact that it has, often a very long-standing impact that it has. So yes, I grew up in this, what I could language even as a child as a dysfunctional family. I knew it was an alcoholic family. I knew that my stepdad had something going on, but I sort of couldn't give it language. It was just like, even as a kid, you're like, well, he's just an asshole and he's a bully and he's a tyrant and he has two different faces, and why do people like him? And, you know, I could sort of speak to all of that. But even well into my adulthood, decades later, as I'm pursuing a degree in psychology, I am a clinical psychologist, I have a private practice, I was never able to connect the dots of what happened, what it actually was, and what it did to me. So not only because emotional abuse and childhood abuse is really easy to minimize. And we do have a lot of data on that because we need our caregivers to survive, right? As a species, human beings, we live with our caregivers until 18, you know, plus years. And so we are very quick to, it's all unconscious, it's survival strategies to say, oh, they can't really be bad. I must be bad. And we take it on ourselves and we think we can fix it. We can change it. Maybe I'm not worthy, but I'll become worthy. All of these sort of classic symptoms of childhood trauma. So there's this sort of hidden piece of emotional abuse. There's the fact that it was childhood abuse and it was all I really knew too, right? So I'm sort of growing up in it, and that kind of creates this thing. And then a feature of narcissistic abuse in particular is gaslighting. So gaslighting is when you are trying to make someone question their reality. It's this intentional sort of manipulation that says, it's not me, it's you. You're the sensitive one, crazy one, you're the liar, all of that. And so I grew up in gaslighting. So the combination of all of these three sort of had me holding the facts of my story on one hand, but the symptoms or the severity or the way I sort of quantified it as like real trauma, it was, I couldn't do it for many, many decades. And what happened is that my stepdad died about 5 or 6 years ago now. And when he died, and this is a feature of trauma, is that the body is in charge, right? I can have all kinds of opinions and thoughts and be seeking things, but ultimately when it comes to safety and survival, the body is in charge. And my body responded to my stepfather's death by this just release of, I feel safer in the world than maybe I have ever felt. And that released me back into sort of my experiences and my story, alongside the fact that, you know, he never righted any wrongs. He went to his grave sort of thinking that I was still the bad guy and convincing my mom that I was the bad guy. And I just had this desperate need, really, to take my story back, to take my truth back. And it came through writing in a way I had never, ever written before. I had no intentions of writing a memoir, certainly not on complex trauma, but the writing came for me. And excuse me, what I love about this aspect of my experience, because it feels so hopeful to me, is that here I was on one hand, like a lifetime pursuit of betterment, like I'm going to figure this out and I'm going to achieve and I'm going to whatever. All very conscious attempts at healing. I didn't really know that language, but that's what it was. And then healing started pursuing me.
Interesting.
In this way that was so surprising. I didn't know what it was about for many years. I was like, why am I writing all of these stories? Like they dropped into my lap, these memories fully intact. I could tell you what I was wearing. I knew the dialogue verbatim. It was like it was locked in these places in my mind. And I just finally had to digest it. You know, like in the language of EMDR, it's like I needed to reprocess those memories. They were really locked in sort of this right brain psychological memory. And I didn't know it. And I didn't know that they were also dictating every other choice that I was making in my life. And so when it started coming, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it felt important. And it was years in that I could look down at everything I'd written, not only what happened in my childhood, but all my dysfunctional relationships and all of my striving and all of these, what I came to understand as trauma responses. It was the whole story. And I could look down at it, finally get enough distance and see it, how it all hung together and say, this is complex trauma. I have complex PTSD as a result of narcissistic abuse. And I had never seen it before. And then I am into the writing and I now have this language and it feels personal to me. And I go on social media and I start looking up hashtag narcissistic abuse, hashtag complex trauma. And it opens up just this whole other world where I was unaware that this larger conversation was even happening because I didn't have the language for it. Why would I be participating in it? Right. I mean, in the trauma space, I was for my clients and in my trainings, but not for me personally. So it just changed my entire life. And now I feel like if I was a trauma therapist and a clinical psychologist who didn't know that she had complex trauma, that didn't know that it was narcissism or what the impact of emotional abuse and neglect and all these things, how many people are walking around reenacting trauma, not knowing that that's what it is? You know, how many people are walking around going, I must just be broken. There's something fundamentally wrong with me. Why can't I have successful relationships? If I had all that information and it didn't change it, what I have to offer is my story, is my lived experience, because that I think people can hear and resonate with. They go, oh yeah, that I had that experience. That makes sense to me. And if they resonate with my story, it can give them more permission to access some of the clinical language where they finally feel like, oh, this is what it is. And we're not just on a hamster wheel somewhere else, feeling like we're working really hard, but going nowhere.
I mean, there's so many things that you mentioned that I have so many questions about. I love just to start when you talk about our caregivers, right? Because we're born into these situations and we don't know anything different. So I think there is a moment in every child's life where they go to someone else's home and they realize that whatever they're experiencing is not either the norm in many different ways. Either they have too much or they have too little, or their parents are too kind, or their parents are not kind enough. But I think we all as children go through this experience of like, oh, what's going on at home? It doesn't happen for everyone, right? And it could be traumatic. And I feel I experienced that as well in a different way. So when you mentioned that, is like part of it is not just this idea of like, oh, was this really happening and was it bad? Like, how do you know if it's bad unless it's really physical, unless it's something that's so blatantly obvious, which is why I love this idea of complex trauma. When I first heard you talk about that, I was really curious about what does that mean? And hearing you explain it, that's something that is consistent over time. It was really like so many realizations for me, because you can have that in any relationship.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing we know about trauma, and this is why it's such a shame that we sort of still have these archaic ideas that it's like, no, it's a life or death event, and that's what trauma is. Trauma isn't the event. Trauma is when our nervous systems are overwhelmed. Okay, and it's very individual. So 5 different people, and you see this in families all the time, 5 different people can go through the same thing and they will be impacted very differently. For one person, it's like, yeah, that was a Tuesday, no big deal. For someone else, they are living in that traumatic memory and they can't escape it. And it informs every day of their life, every decision that they make. So it's also just a matter of how our individual nervous systems process it. So in a way, the markers for complex trauma aren't so much like, was my story bad enough? Like I have a silly video on YouTube where I go, here's my trauma measuring stick. Like, you know, where do I fall? It's more about what are the symptoms that I'm living with? Because those symptoms of hypervigilance and the negative self-concept and trauma reenactment and constantly in a trauma bond, or compulsively caretaking and people pleasing because I don't feel safe enough to be in my own skin. Those symptoms in a way are more indicative of having gone through a traumatic event than languaging the event itself.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because humans are so complex. And, you know, as I know about your story, your stepdad was inappropriate with you growing up and your mother didn't believe you, even when there was a room full of professionals telling her, you know, you should pay attention to this.
Right. Yeah, I had an intervention in as a junior in high, or what, maybe a senior in high school. Anyway, I was 16 with social services. And it certainly seemed bad enough to me. It seemed bad enough to the counselor at school as a mandated reporter to make a report. But it wasn't really, you know, what are they going to do with that level of abuse, of like grooming? It was, I don't even know if they had the language of grooming then, but being groomed and being gaslit, it's sort of like, it's not that bad. And so that's how I carried it in my body for all these years. Maybe it wasn't that bad. And I would say, well, he didn't rape me. Well, he didn't this, and he did do this, right? Part of the feature of trauma bonding is that it's not all bad. It's about intermittent reinforcement. So there's some really bad stuff, but there's some good stuff too. And particularly in contrast to the bad, the good stuff can feel great. And so in some ways I'm like, you know, all of my basic needs were met. And so it's so confusing. It's so confusing coming out of this thing, which is again why I think our shared stories matter so much.
And when dealing with this narcissistic experience, confusion is something that I really want people to hear about, because, you know, I had a different childhood upbringing than you. My mother had her own narcissistic issues, which now I'm dealing with it as she's getting older. It's becoming more and more blatantly, you know, that's where I came from and what really shaped my perception of family and, you know, being an adult and being a mother and things like that. But I just had this, you know, recent narcissistic relationship that it took me a long time to figure it out. And I still question myself, like, and he's questioning me. Like I got a call from him recently saying, I just want to tell you my side of the story because I feel like you're changing reality to fit your narrative.
Oh,
I thought, okay, sure, let's hear it. And he went on for 15 minutes about how he just wants to be good and how things are okay. And like, why do we need bad blood? You know, he also got hurt. And I did this one thing in the entirety I've ever met him that it was so heartbreaking for him. He couldn't get over it. And then all his behavior after that justified. But it was exactly what you said in your experience with your stepdad, that it was like, I love you. And he would actually say that to me, like, it's
yeah.
always been you. And then the events that followed was like, man, if you saw me on the street, you'd have ran me over with a car.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's so hard to conciliate those two things in this, like, you know, cognitive dissonance of like, how can you say you love me when your behavior and your actions are so unloving?
And I think for a lot of people, myself included, right? Like there's a reason I became a therapist, in part because I believe in the power of growth and change, right? So I've endowed people with that my entire life. So if someone comes to me and they say, I'm willing to work on this, right? And not that they're necessarily putting any action behind it, but even the words alone for a long time carried a lot of meaning, right? Like even if it was like taking fake sort of personal responsibility, it was a big hook for me because I was like, how can I give up on this person? They're willing to da da da. And the other thing that you basically just outlined is a very common strategy with narcissistic abuse, which is the acronym D.A.R.V.O, D-A.R.V.O, which is deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, right? So it is this like, I'm the victim here and you aggressed me in this way. And yes, and this is the thing that justifies all of my behavior. And it's gaslighting, right? It's like, wait, maybe and the other thing about being the recipient of gaslighting, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, it's like touching sort of an emotional place in me. We want it to work. We want things to get better. And if it's my fault, I have some control over that, right? So there's a reason that I also worked so hard my whole life to like be a good girl, improve my worth. It was like, I wanted to believe that I could run all of this, whatever it was, through my system and then we would all be sort of fixed. And the problem is that never happened. I ran all of this through my system and ultimately believed on some level deep down that it was me, that it was my fault. And that's, you know, we talk about with complex PTSD, there's a real corrosion around your very sense of self. You don't really know who you are or what is true. And we are often filled with just this toxic shame. It was like I was polluted. I felt like I was polluted, but I didn't know it was because I was holding the shame for the entire family system, right? It's like a classic scapegoat scenario. So once we know these things, it's like, this is not mine. This is not mine. And that's a part of what the writing gave me. It was like, I'm handing the origins back and where they belong. And I'm freeing myself so that I can finally, maybe for the first time in my whole life, as now a 48-year-old woman, go, who am I really? Who am I really? And I think that's a common thing with complex trauma, is it's this like reclaiming of self. It's this coming back, maybe back, or maybe for the first time ever, to a truer, authentic, freer, cleaner, unencumbered version of self. And it's powerful. And it's why this work is so worth it, because it's the hardest thing I've also ever done, hands down. Like, so painful, the things you have to face and wade through and feel, not for the faint of heart. But I say it every single time, and I mean it even more over time, is that it's worth it. It's worth it because I'm worth it. I'm worth fighting for. As hard as I fought for everybody else to try to save your life and their life, and I'll fix you, and I've got it, and it's cool. It's like, it's my turn.
And I'm smiling because you were able to put into words exactly how I felt in the downfall of that relationship, because it was like, it was your fault. If you didn't do this one thing in the entire 3 years I've known you, that makes me question your integrity, you know, we would be together. And exactly that, I believed, well, if this is something that I did, and I thought of everything that happens in life, the one thing I can control is how I behave, and maybe that wasn't my best moment, then I can control it, right? Then I can show the opposite. Then I can show them that I am good, that I'm not what they think I am, that this is not what it looks like. And you go on this journey on trying to go back to where you were. And through the entire time, and I'm saying maybe that period lasted a month and a half of trying to mend that relationship.
Yeah.
And that person was just punishing me and punishing me and punishing me through the whole process. But there would be a day or two when it was exactly what you're saying. I love you. I miss you. Please, can we go back? Can we be back together? Can we do this? And I remember thinking exactly the same thing. I have changed so much in the last year alone.
Yeah.
When somebody comes to me and say, I have changed, I want to mend this, can we work this out? Which I have had friendships be mended, then I believe in the possibility of it. Then I go, okay. So when this person came around and said, I'm sorry, I just want us to be good. My father almost died. I had an awakening. For a minute, I believed it. And then I thought, oh, wait, this is how this started. He had a book, that he read, and he was an awakening. And I was like, oh, he's using the same thing that worked out before. Well, guess what? This time is not going to work.
Yes.
And when I had this conversation, I had to literally, like a child, outline, when this happened, how did I behave? When this happened, how did I behave? When this happened, when you did this, what did I do? Did I treat you with respect? Did I treat you with kindness? And it's just silence on the other side of the line. And I was talking about this with a friend. She said to me, it sounds like, progress. And I said, what do you mean by that? She goes, well, it sounded like he was founding some empathy. And I said, wow, exactly. Like, I don't want to have to talk to someone and teach them what empathy is by outlining the ways that they have been misbehaved in just a human level, and the ways that like people treat you when you make a mistake versus when you are like fundamentally wrong. And I think it comes to that shame.
Well, you're making a couple good points that I want to highlight, because one, this lack of empathy really is the cornerstone of narcissism.
Oh, that's so hard.
It's so hard. And so I think for empathetic people, the idea that someone really couldn't take you in, the idea that it really is all about them, is a really hard pill to swallow. And I think it's why, unless you've had this experience, you almost can't wrap your head around it.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of us, and rightfully so, we don't want to believe in a world where this happens. And quite frankly, it happens so readily, because it's devastating. It's devastating. But the second thing that you talked about is the pattern. And so maybe we get hooked in and we go, oh, but they're willing to apologize in quotes. They're willing to work on it. And they have their own childhood trauma and they have their own stuff going on. Okay, that's fine, right? But when we see it happening again and again and again, and it never, like you said, I've worked through difficulties in relationships, and we're able to kind of compromise, and we find an equal footing. That will never happen in the narcissistic relationship. The only way to find peace is when we get willing to abandon ourselves, ignore the real problem. We start to shrink and we start to become molded into this kind of perfect supply, what they would call in the narcissism language, for the narcissist. They're just like using you for all of your goodness and kind of just discarding the rest. And that's what it starts to feel like. That's what it really starts to feel like. So I just wanted to point those two things out from a kind of a clinical perspective, that look for the patterns, that you might not see it in advance. You might not see it on a first date. But if you feel like you're stuck in a cycle, it's really important to look at what are the themes that are playing out here over and over again? And how can I do it differently instead of hoping that they're going to do it differently? Because that's always the fantasy, right? It's like, yes. No, they're going to see the truth. They're going to wake up and see my worth. They're going to be willing to do the work. And if you don't see evidence for that, I mean, hardcore evidence for that, we have to be the ones to go, no, I'm the one who needs to change in this system.
And that's what I realized, at the end. And I love that you mentioned this idea that they take something from you in a sense of like belief, because what really broke my heart, and you know, it took me so long, and I'm not even sure if I mended that for myself, of like, there was this romantic idea of love that I had before I met this person, that this person destroyed.
Yes.
You know, this romanticized idea that like the core goodness in people, and it makes me emotional just thinking about it, because it's like that naive sense of like searching for love that I had.
Yeah.
It's been changed forever, you know, and maybe in other, you know, as I engage with people who are kinder and more present, like I realize like my idea of love has changed, and maybe that is for the best. But it does feel like they take that sense that people can be intrinsically good. And I think I held on so long for that reason, because if I admitted to myself that this person, in fact, really had only their best interest at heart, it meant that I was wrong, that I bred the situation wrong, that some people cannot change. And that was very hard for me to give up.
Yes, yes. And it's a part of the manipulation tactic to really kind of mine the other person for what is your fairy tale version of love. What are you looking for? Well, I'm going to morph into that. You know, that's this love bombing phase of narcissistic abuse. It's not just like showing up with roses, because your thing might not be roses. Your thing might be this other thing that you basically told them on day one means everything to you. And so they subtly or not so subtly lean into that. I think if I didn't already say it, there's future faking involved. It's like, oh, this is what you want for your life. Well, I'm going to tell you, I want the same exact thing. And we just kind of eat it up, you know, because it feels so good. It is like a drug.
And you feel seen.
Fast. What's that?
You feel seen. Oh my God.
Oh, yes.
This person, they get what I get. Like we're in sync. Amazing.
Yes. It's the fairy tale. It can feel so powerful, you know, and I experienced that in my adult life too. So yeah. And we can go in, if you want, to the reasons why, from a trauma perspective, I continued to find myself in abusive, narcissistic, you know, unavailable relationships, because it happened over and over and over, to where I was certain that I could not have a healthy relationship.